Hello, and welcome to Learning Target 2.4, Ecological Succession. Congratulations on making it to this learning target. Ecological succession is a fairly straightforward and simple topic, and we'll start right away with the definition. Ecological succession, you should practice saying that term a few times because it's kind of a mouthful, are predictable changes in a community over time. A community is all the living organisms in the environment. So community are the biotic factors is another way to think about that. So just to show you another image here of what I'm talking about, when you see ecological succession, I want you to think about changes in a community over time, and specifically we're talking about mainly plants, but also when plants change, other things change too. And these changes are more or less predictable, where one community replaces another, or in fact one community makes the land and soil usable for the next community, and over time you go from this beginning stage to this end stage. And you're going to be responsible for understanding how these things develop and what these different stages are and the types of organisms that interact within these stages. There's two different types of succession that you need to be familiar with. The first type is called primary succession. Primary succession begins on bare rock, meaning that there was never soil in that place. There's no soil whatsoever. It's land covered in rock. That's it. So an example of where you could see primary succession take place are after a volcanic eruption. Lava flows down the side of the volcano, destroys everything in its path, and after some time that lava, that magma, cools down into a solid igneous rock, and there's no soil there whatsoever. Another example could be after a glacier melts. As a glacier recedes, it melts and it leaves behind in its path rocks. No soil has been there for many, many, many years. So these are two examples of primary succession that occur on bare rock when there's no soil. Now, as you may suspect, there's also another type of succession called secondary succession. And these occur after some kind of natural disaster like a flood or a fire or a tornado or some kind of significant human disturbance. So some examples could be like deforestation, when humans come in and chop down all the trees. A fire, like I mentioned previously. Okay? So I just want to go back to the slide for one more second. Now, the difference here between primary succession and secondary succession have to do with what exactly is happening in the two different occurrences here, but also has to do with the amount of soil. In primary succession, there's no soil, and in secondary succession, the soil is already there. And this impacts the type of organisms that can be growing in that particular environment. So what I'm going to do right now is show you a series of images. I want you to pause the video and think for a minute about whether or not the type of succession you're looking at is primary or secondary. Here's the first image. Is this primary or secondary succession? Pause the video, think about it. You have to go back to the definitions and see them again. Do so. Okay, this is secondary succession. This is after a forest fire, a natural disaster. You can see that there's still soil on the ground. How about this next one? Pause the video. Okay, this is primary succession, because here you see glaciers receding. These glaciers are melting, and what they're leaving behind in the U-shaped valley is rock. And rock is not soil, at least not yet. How about this one? Pause the video. This is secondary succession. This is an example of where trees have been chopped down, deforestation you could call it as well. The soil is already there, so succession occurs in a different way. Okay, let's move on. Next one. What's this? A hint, this is a lava flow. Right, this is primary succession. Good job. Primary succession is because this is just rock. There's no soil here. Okay, I'm glad that we got differences down between primary and secondary succession. You're definitely going to need that. You need to know that for your upcoming assessments. Now, when we think about two different types of succession, the first organism to move into an area has a name. It's called a pioneer species. Now, if you think about history, the pioneers are typically people that move to new land. They're the first to settle there. If you're a pioneer in industry or technology or business, you're usually the first person to come up with something new and innovative. Same thing goes on here in ecosystems. A pioneer species is the first organism to come to an area of bare land, whether it be after primary or secondary succession. Here's a couple examples of two pioneer species. Over here on the left, we have an organism called moss. Moss is a very primitive type of plant. Over here, we have a cool organism called a lichen. We'll talk more about them in a second. Lichens are really cool because they can actually turn rock into soil. So a lot of times you see lichens move in after primary succession when there's only rock. Moss come in for either primary or secondary succession. You can see lichens in secondary succession too. Another pioneer species that's not in this series of images here are something called ferns as well. They're another primitive type of plant that were around during the dinosaurs. Now a little more about lichens, connecting it to our last learning target, our last few learning targets. Have you ever seen like plants growing on sidewalks or the side of buildings or something that look like this? That's a lichen. And lichens are actually symbiotic organisms that are really pretty interesting because they're the combination of algae, which is a producer autotroph, or a plant, living together in conjunction and cooperation. Mutualism actually is what's going on here as a fungus. So the algae and the fungus live together. Fungus is a decomposer. They provide the protection and the support and the water source for the algae. And the algae, by doing photosynthesis, they're autotrophs. They make their own energy. They're able to give some of that energy to the fungus. Now, I was going to ask you what type of symbiotic relationship this is, but I kind of gave it away before. So which one is this? It's mutualism. Both organisms benefit. Remember the two smiley faces? Thumbs up, thumbs up. The algae is happy and the fungus is happy. But anyways, you're not going to need to know that. I just thought it was an interesting connection to something you already know. Remember, lichens are pioneer organisms. Back to succession now, guys. Okay, here we go. Now, one thing I want you to notice here is the soil levels. Now, over here after the fire, here's the soil. And right here, things aren't so great for a lot of new organisms to come in. It takes some time. So first you have the pioneer species come in, and the pioneer species like the mosses and these plants that come back every so years leads to grasses, and the grasses prepare the soil for these other intermediate species like shrubs and pines and hickory trees. And they're adding soil and they're adding different types of things for the ecosystem to be able to transition to the next community, which is called the climax community. And the idea here is that each community, each series of organisms prepares the area's soil for the next community until it reaches the last stage. And that last stage is what you'll need to know as the climax community. The climax community is mature, large trees, and this is the way what happens during succession. You start with this pioneer community here, and over time you have these intermediates, and eventually these larger trees and the largest, most stable trees. And when a community or an area, an ecosystem reaches this climax community, it's said to have reached its most stable state. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that things aren't changing. It just means that things are staying relatively similar. Over here you see more rapid change. Over here you may see slight changes. And we'll see this back and forth. It's another example of balance. It's called dynamic equilibrium. It's almost a little bit like carrying capacity. When a population goes up, it comes back down. Same thing's happening here in the climax community. It's relatively stable, but that doesn't mean that it's not changing at all. It's just changing in a way that goes back to this stable state. Other thing, connecting to previous learning, is biodiversity. When you reach a climax community, this is when you have the highest levels of biodiversity and the most variety in organisms living in that particular area. So you should know the relationship between climax communities and biodiversity for your assessments. Okay, here's a couple of little check-ins. Is this a pioneer or a climax community? This is a climax community. You see mature, old, larger trees covering a wide area. Is there more biodiversity here or less biodiversity? This is more biodiversity because the climax community has the largest amounts of organisms living in there. All right, how about this one? Pioneer or Climax? This is a pioneer. It's a lichen. That symbiotic mutualistic relationship between an algae and a fungus growing on a rock, breaking down the rock into soil. And in this type of environment, you have low amounts of biodiversity. Now, the other thing you should know is that succession can also happen in a pond, not just in areas of forest. Take a minute, look at these pictures here. Pause the video. Which order do you think they go in? Right? Use this as a clue to help you figure it out. Okay? Well, the correct order here is B, C, A, D. And this is because over time, sometimes lakes get filled in. So you can see the soil beginning to fill in this particular lake. Same thing is happening here in this drawing and here in real life at this lake. So just know that not only does succession happen in forests and on land, but it also happens sometimes in ponds. Okay, so now it's time to check in before we move on to the next set of activities. You should know at this point what ecological succession is. You should be able to explain the difference between the two types of succession, primary and secondary. You should know what a pioneer organism is and give an example of the three different types. You should be able to know what a climax community is and the relationship between a climax community and biodiversity. And lastly, you should know how the amount of soil in an environment plays a role in ecological succession. Okay, that's the end of this video clip. Next step for you is to maybe go back and take notes again or move on to the assignment where you're going to be going through a lot of different animations. And when you're ready, I'll see you for the verbal quiz. Okay, until next time.